I'm S.A. Bradley. I'm your moderator, and I'm the creator of Hellbent for Horror, the Rondo-nominated, yes, 4-time Rondo-nominated podcast, never a winner, that looks at how culture shapes our horror stories and how horror stories shape our culture. With us today is Danger Slater, a novelist, and he's also able to balance on very small
I'm just squatting
stages.
here.
Yeah, he doesn't even have a chair. It's amazing. He's a novelist, screenwriter, and performer out of Oregon who has written 8 books, with his novel I Rot Without You seeing translations in multiple countries and winning the Wonderland Award in 2016. They give them every year, I think. Right?
Yeah.
So that was
Sometimes.
He gets it every year.
I give it to myself every year.
Yeah, right. Some of the other books are He Digs a Hole, Puppet Skin, and Impossible James, which I highly recommend if you haven't read it. Nicholas P. Robinson is the author of the books You Will Be Consumed, Unspoken, Trapped, a Dark Dozen anthology. He's also a former musician. He doesn't like to talk about it, so we're going to talk about it extensively and nothing else. The relatively unknown industrial gothic musical project Alter Noctem, Alter Item, roughly translated from Latin into English as Another Night, Another Identity. Shit Falls Where It Falls, I think is the other name for it. He provided vocals, bass, percussion, and some synth programming. He's also a freelance photographer and videographer with more than a decade of experience in broadcasting and television, so someone who really understands the visual image and how it can impact people. His early morning hours are spent on his day job, so we're really grateful that he's still awake right now, where he is a news producer for Good Day, Oregon, for the Portland Fox affiliate. Welcome, everyone. Thanks a lot for being on the show.
Yeah, thanks.
So this panel's about horror having this rich history of commenting on the real world. In other words, I tend to say that horror comments on the culture, and the culture is constantly changing how horror is being shown. As creators, do you feel that you do this with things that you've written, and if you have put in some form of commentary, was it intentional or did you find it later?
I almost have that in every single thing I write. I like to think of the surface story as what's happening, but the real story is the allegory and the kind of undercurrent of the things that are driving all of it. So yeah, it is very intentional to kind of interject metaphor and allegory into what I'm doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think everyone does it. I mean, it's whether we do it intentionally or not, it's unavoidable.
It's really interesting when someone reads something and then they have a whole other reading on it, and
weird.
you're just like, that's actually better than what I thought.
Yeah.
I think I'm just going to say that from now on.
You're way more insightful than I was.
Yeah.
But yeah, like the short story that I put in that Trapped anthology, it deals with empowering women who are damaged, and so it's apropos of our current culture pretty frequently. But I mean, it's always that way. I think Godzilla was nuclear war. I mean, it's all allegorical.
Yeah. It's funny because there are people who will say, oh, I can't stand horror now because it's all political. And I'm like, it has always been political. You may not have noticed because you were on the right side of history at that moment, but as of right now, you're just having a little bit of a problem with it. And you can go all the way back to 1931 Frankenstein. But even earlier than that, you can go to the early Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, where essentially, if you look at it, if you really take a look at the history, she's talking about the Industrial Revolution. People say, oh, it's all about don't meddle with God stuff. Well, they didn't have genetic engineering or GMOs or anything like that. You know what they had? They had steam. Yeah. And steam was suddenly starting to change what was happening in the pastoral England. England used to be all farms. All of a sudden, the steam engine starts, the industrialists come on in, and you start making machines quickly that are doing a whole bunch of stuff. And the next thing you know, we have the Industrial Revolution. She's part of the era of Romanticism, which is coming off of the very edge of the Enlightenment era. Enlightenment gives us the Industrial Revolution, and the Romantic era comes out of the damage that the Industrial Revolution did. There was no OSHA then. They used to have in the London paper a thing that was called the meat grinder, which was every day how many people lost arms and legs. And it wasn't just men. Entire families were working there.
Bring back child labor.
Yeah, child labor was happening. So when you look at it, when she's talking about, yeah, you can look at it if you want, as it's just a dead guy coming back to life. Or if you're saying that she actually lived in the world, and she may have been a poet, and she may have seen a pastoral garden suddenly turned into a bunch of steam engines, and people are dying, alcoholism's up, people are living 16 in a room, perhaps she was talking about how inhumane we were looking at each other, that we were nothing but pieces of meat at that time, and she was making that comment. Consciously or unconsciously, it was in the mix, because artists live in the world. You know, I always laugh. The most political thing that you can say is that your shit isn't about anything. You know, that's like total denial right there. So anyway, before I go deep down on that kind of thing, let's talk a little bit about, you mentioned Godzilla. So yeah. Godzilla is one of my favorites, because there's also the counterpoint to that.
Yeah. Well, that's the most obvious one. Yeah. Like right there, I mean, the stand-in for nuclear war and a response to the end of World War II. I mean,
well, especially Japan's response,
where
it's like it's destroying everything.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's really interesting, because at that time, there's two ways to look at what's happening with the nuclear bomb. So you have the United States answer, which is them, right? The giant ants that come out of Los Alamos, and then go into the
Night of the
sewers.
Lipas too. I mean, all that other stuff.
Night of the Lipas, tarantula, all of those. And all of those have a certain thing going on with them, right? Because if you're looking at what the message is kind of in that is, something's after us. We fucked up. And we have taken Pandora's box and said, oh, that was really nice. We've thrown it away, and now we've wrought something. So there's a nervousness that we have, an anxiety of what have we done. But the second question, why are we so worried about these ants? Well, they're coming for us. The second thing is, once you open that box, it's like any weapon that's ever been made, it's going to get used. So the chances are someone else is going to use it, and welcome to the Cold War. So all of a sudden, what's the answer to these ants? Bomb them, blow them up, set them on fire. That's what you do down in the sewers of LA. It interests me that Godzilla, when that came out, and the Godzilla that we saw wasn't the Godzilla that came out in Japan. We get William Burr going, oh my God, or Raymond Burr going, look how big he is. Oh, he's doing the things. They had a much darker side to the original Gojira. And what was happening at the time was the Bikini Atoll. We were still bombing Bikini Atoll. We were doing all of these tests, and some Japanese ships were taken down because of it. At that same time, MacArthur is still in Japan, and you cannot speak about the war. You cannot speak about the bomb. It is quiet censorship that's happening now that it's an occupied area at that point. So they come up with a monster movie. And to me, Godzilla is like, it happens in less than a decade from when the bombs are dropped on civilians, right? That's kind of like us making a monster movie about 9/11 a couple years after it happened. It would never happen.
Cloverfield?
Yes, exactly. There we go. So we have those images that come up like that. To me, it's really intriguing that it was a reckoning, not just a commentary on the nuclear war, but there was this reckoning that was happening by Godzilla comes up, he doesn't attack New York, doesn't attack LA, he attacks Tokyo. It's a recreation of what's happened. So there's this whole feeling, people had to be carried out of that movie. It seems like to us it might have just been a second-hand King Kong for some people. But for Japan at that time, that was the only way that they could comment on something, and that they wanted to comment. They didn't want to comment about what happened there. It was horribly destructive. Yeah. They found an outlet for it, and that's the cultural shadow work that I think that horror allows us to do. So you mentioned Cloverfield. Do you have anything that you want to say?
Oh, no, I mean, that was clearly representative of how America felt after 9/11.
Yeah,
I mean,
dust flying down, giant monster coming.
People covered in dust.
Statue of Liberty's head flying across the pavement.
So we had atomic warfare and Godzilla, and I like to say, if you want to really know what freaked out a generation, look at their B movies, their horror movies, their exploitation films. Not necessarily the ones that are venerated, but go to the ones that are exploitation, because they need to know how to creep you out. They need to know how to piss you off, because you're either going to watch it out of outrage, or you're going to watch it because you're really interested to see how far they're going to go. So whatever the button push is of the time, look at the horror movies. With that said, what ones are you guys thinking about? What movies would you say kind of have that?
That have that characteristic to them? 120 Days of Sodom.
Yeah, there we go, Sallow.
Fucking Human Centipede. As far as recent examples of that sort of thing, I mean, movies that are just genuinely made to make people upset.
Well, it also works on a personal level too. I mean, we're talking about cultural,
Yes.
Versions of this. The culture, reflection of culture. It also reflects on a personal,
Yeah,
Absolutely.
point of view too. And just using these giant kaiju movies, since that's what we were talking about, there's another movie that came out a few years ago called Colossal.
Oh,
It
that was fantastic.
Starred Anne Hathaway, and it was basically a Godzilla movie, except she would puppet this Godzilla when she would get blackout drunk. It was about alcoholism and recovery and
the damage you cause.
Yes, and the damage you cause. And she meets another guy who's also damaged, and he kind of is leading her in the wrong direction, and she has to learn to get a hold of herself and get a hold of this thing that she controls. And so it doesn't always have to be gigantic thing about like this is what is happening in the world. It works on all sorts of levels.
Absolutely.
Well, yeah, we constantly, well, we talked about it before, we project our own neuroses and insecurities and psychological battles into the things that we create, too.
I mean, Frankenstein, and I'm glad that you brought that up, because most people tend to think when you talk about shadow work and stuff like that and how a movie affects you. The reason I did this culturally is that it's micro, macro. Most people get the micro. Like, most people will talk about Frankenstein, right? And they're not going to talk about the Industrial Revolution and stuff. They're going to talk about being an outsider, which is the ultimate thing that Frankenstein does. It gives us a face, somebody that we can recognize. Most people that are deep into horror, somewhere on their body, there's a Frankenstein tattoo, because we usually get that. If you're queer, most people who are into queer horror tend to find themselves really identifying with Frankenstein. So it's a very, very important thing that you bring up there. It's also the idea that I like to think that unconsciously the culture is it tells the truth on us. One of the things I like to talk about is ugly laws. Did you know that there were ugly laws in the United States? Yeah, there were several cities. So ugly laws happened right around World War I when people started coming back all amputated and stuff like that. First one was in liberal San Francisco. It wasn't liberal at that time. San Francisco was San Francisco. But they had laws that after you could only come out at night, really. During the day, you couldn't be out in front of children and stuff if you were missing an arm. If you were blind. And a lot of this was to push the riffraff out of the main areas so that businesses could work without panhandling. Sound familiar? So anyway, there was this whole deal where there was the ugly laws. And it finally got overturned because there were so many World War I veterans coming back that it became a wave. But what's interesting is that a lot of people, because of the way that the bombs would blast, people would lose eyes, they'd lose their jaws, they'd lose part of their face. So one of the things that came out of this was a new business, prosthetics. And one of the big prosthetics was a porcelain face. First silent monster is the Phantom of the Opera. And what's he doing? He's wearing a big porcelain mask over the face. The big thing is pulling it off, and you see the screaming, nasty face. The first guy that we love made most of his movies, Lon Chaney, Man of a Thousand Faces. There were people without legs. There were people without arms. They had sometimes it was epileptic he played, and they were almost always evil. So the thing is, anytime, whether we like the movie or not, it's kind of telling the truth because it's coming from us. It's our psyche. So we look back and we can go, whoa, at that time, geez, we were doing some nasty stuff. The harder thing is seeing the movies now and how they're talking about us. Any modern ideas that you have? Any movies that have hit you recently that you go, wow, that feels like it's right on the nose?
Well, Barbarian was kind of like that.
Talk about it.
Well, as far as the way that Detroit has fallen apart and just kind of what lurks underneath all of that. It was a pretty unsettling movie, all things considered. It was entertaining as hell, but...
Yeah, it's a crazy movie. That one and Don't Breathe.
Oh, yeah. Well, and like
That was also Detroit, right?
Yeah, that was also Detroit.
Well, and like It Follows with like the commentary on like the fact that people have become more promiscuous again. People are less concerned about things like HIV now. Out of nowhere, it seems that people are just less and less concerned. There are rising rates of syphilis and things along those lines, stuff that is treatable or curable. And I feel like It Follows was a good commentary on that.
Yeah. Very interesting. So I've heard another interpretation of that. And so we'll see, raising hands, what people say. So how many of you that have seen It Follows, first off, how many people saw It Follows? 3 people. It's not a.
It was an amazing movie. Everybody should.
But it's a great
atmosphere.
movie.
Fantastic
The
atmosphere.
atmosphere is great, and it's one of those movies that when we talk about liminal horror is one of the instigators of that.
It's a movie you definitely want to watch twice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's better the second time.
And pay attention
Yeah.
to the background of the
And
song.
alone.
So the second thing that I heard from a woman who directs films is that it's a Me Too film.
Oh yeah.
And that it's really about not being believed by anybody,
Yeah.
but having it be someone that you know that hurts you. And what happens is it propagates again and again and again. And the more that you try to let people know, it's going to kill you.
Well, and then there's the whole hurt people thing.
Yep, hurt people. Yeah,
Alien.
yeah.
Thinking specifically on just so much of like the symbolism of that movie, like you get infected by something without your control, and then you are forced to essentially have a pregnancy without your consent.
And then it forces its way out
And
of
then it
you.
forces its way out of you and dies.
Yeah. There's Rosemary's Baby.
Yep.
Where that's about as topical as can be right now. Because if you look at that movie, you've got women telling another woman that the fetus has more rights than she does.
Well, it was Satan's child.
It was Satan's child after all, and there was that really nasty tea. But I love that movie because of the banality of evil, right? It doesn't sit there and tell you that these people are going to be. It's the older generation, right? Telling you everything's going to be just fine. Oh, don't worry, you've gone through that before. And the more that you argue against that, the more attacks there are on you.
Well, and that leads into like the Stepford Wives
Yeah.
and everything too.
Absolutely.
That one remake that came out relatively recently, the Invisible. No, it's not.
Invisible Man?
There's a remake of that, but
Yeah.
Yeah.
Not the shitty one with Kevin Bacon.
Okay, I can't remember what it was. The one with the lady who was in the Handmaid's Tale.
Yeah,
Yeah.
not the god awful thing that Kevin Bacon tried.
Yeah,
to-
no. This is the one that
Hollow Man.
Lee Wannell did, the guy who was in Saw.
Yep.
Yeah, there's some great examples. I guess the reason I asked about the intentional nature of us creating things and bringing something in is I think it can't happen subconsciously because we're just in this stew.
Yeah.
One of the things that I love is Toby Hooper, director of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, in an interview said, sometimes you don't know what your movie's about for 20 years. And it's a great line because it also says that you're working on a different level sometimes. You don't necessarily, because you're in it, you don't see why these things happen. Even crappy movies. There was a B movie, a science fiction movie from the 50s, where the villain tossed a nuclear rod on the ground like you're wont to do. And the hero looks down and goes, oh my God, and he has a pail of water, and he picks it up and throws it in the pail of water and goes, whew! And it's like, that's absurd, right? Yet at the same time, how that's culturally relevant? It could have been anything else. Could have been a bomb. Could have been something microbial. It could have been a beast. But it was a nuclear rod. Why was nuclear rod the scariest thing that could be on the ground there? And that's already commenting on what the anxieties are at the time. So what you figure is going to be your red herring, what is going to be your MacGuffin, usually comes out of what's important for the audience to take into consideration at that point. So did you guys ever like a movie when you were a kid and then years later grow up, realize, oh shit, I thought that was just a funny movie, but now that's dark.
We were just talking about
Yeah.
Nightmare on Elm Street too.
Yeah, there's that. But actually, the one I want to bring up because I just recently went to see the play version of. I grew up watching Little Shop of Horror over and over and over again, but I recently went to the play.
Oh, yeah.
In Portland here, and I didn't realize it because I hadn't seen it in a long time that this is an anti-capitalist movie. That they're literally talking about feeding this beast will continue eating, and there's no satiating it, and it will eat and destroy everything. And it's just like, and it's all about Seymour. Like, if I could just do this, if I could just like work harder, if I could just
More
hustle
blood,
right,
more
yeah,
blood.
it literally is fueled by blood, the blood of capitalism. And I did not put any of that together. I just thought it was a cool movie about a plant that ate people and had a bunch of fun songs.
Yeah.
But I loved being at that play. I had a whole new appreciation for it. I got re-obsessed with it again for like months, and I went back and watched the film and everything. So,
oh my God!
yeah.
See, I saw it off Broadway back when it first started out before the movie and everything. Do they still have the Muppet heads at the end that come out of the plant?
Yeah. Oh yeah. And the plant, every time they,
I fucking died over
the
that.
set spun around, and every time they went back into the shop, it just was bigger and slightly bigger.
Oh,
so there was
my God.
like 5 or 6 puppets they did. It was awesome.
Oh, that's so cool. Oh, looks like we have folks in the audience.
She had hers up first.
Okay.
Oh, no, you go.
You're very kind.
Well, I kind of had two questions. So the first one is looking at, like the role of horror in relation to trauma. So I'm thinking about like old nursery school rhymes,
Oh,
even
yeah.
like Ring Around the Rosie, The London Bridge is Falling
Yes.
Down, and how that kind of manifests in modern horror as well. Because like I remember seeing Master and Get Out and really feeling like, oh, thank you.
Yes, right.
Finally, you being seen. So that's like one question. The other question is really in relation to kind of the rise of the anti-hero and seeing more of a murkiness between kind of good and evil as far as portrayals of horror. And that's not only in movies, but even looking at for comics, webtoons, really seeing that rise.
I think-
so those were my two questions.
I think we're recognizing more and more that there is no such thing as black and white. You're always the hero in your own story, and you're going to be the villain in someone else's. The people who attacked the World Trade Center, we are the bad guys. We've been the bad guys in that area of the world for generations at this point. We restructured their boundaries after World War I. We destroyed the Ottoman Empire and created whole new boundaries and political alliances that didn't exist. We just kind of pigeonholed it in there. How couldn't there be resentment? I mean, we systematically destroyed a whole section of the world and raped it. We stole their people, we stole their oil, who wouldn't hate us? But to us, we're the good guys. The Ottoman Empire, they were the bad guys during World War I. And they were. Objectively, they were fucking bad guys. But that doesn't mean that what we did after the fact made it any better. It's the whole 2 wrongs don't make a fucking right. I mean, we learned that as goddamn children. How the hell do adults not fucking know that? But, I mean, that's how it works. There is no black or white. There is no good and fucking evil. It doesn't work that way. This isn't a fucking fairy tale. We live in the real world. And we don't want fiction that is a fairy tale. We want fiction that actually symbolizes something that we can relate to. Heroes that are perfect, villains that are absolutely evil. Who the hell relates to that? Those people don't fucking exist.
See, that's what's wonderful. This is what I love about horror. Horror is tailor-made for allegory and metaphor. It's also the dark child, right? So I will handle situations of talking about this kind of thing through a monster movie much more than I would, say, giving me a documentary about it,
Oh, yeah.
right? So I always like to say, I don't want to watch a documentary about the insurgency, right? But I'll watch zombies take over Congress any fucking day of the week. And so what we have is this distance to very difficult and painful conversations that horror will do better than any other genre, because it is already there in the darkness. And you cannot have darkness or a shadow without some light somewhere. So there's something that's very interesting about that. But what I love is, I grew up on anti-heroes, man. I grew up in the 70s, so every movie ended. There used to be this thing when you go to the movies, and the movie would be, mediocre and stuff, and all of a sudden someone would die.
I'm just talking about Shaft.
And at the end, someone would just go, in the audience would go, that better not be the end. And it would be the end. Because every movie ended like a downer. So the hero had to die and stuff like that. So the anti-hero, I think, is really interesting. We had a force against anti-hero. We already had heroes. Then we had film noir. Then we had anti-heroes. And then we had the 80s. And all of a sudden we had this restructuring of what a hero was supposed to be. And guess what happened? The world went fucking insane. And now we're starting to have the art tell what we already know. That there are nothing but gradations of black and white. And that what we need to do is try and do the next right thing, the next best thing. So it's very intriguing to me. We had another, go ahead. But I think we have one more question.
One thing that I've noticed in a lot of horror that I found interesting is cultural differences based off of the, the geographical origin of like American horror versus
Yes.
Japanese horror is
Oh,
what
yeah.
I think of, because in a lot of Japanese horror, because I play so many Japanese horror video games, a lot of Japanese horror you can't escape.
No, it's
The
like a
end-
disease.
Yeah.
The end you cannot, there is no defeating Kayabo from Ju-on or Samara from Ringu. But in a lot of American horror, you've got the triumph. You might have the end credit scene where the slasher monster's not actually dead, but you usually have the final girl who escapes.
No, that's what I love about Japanese horror is that
Yeah.
it is inexorable. It's that moment that you're in the bathtub bleeding out from your wrists when you change your mind
Yes.
and it's too fucking late. That's the best part about it.
I know, and recently there's been a lot of that South Korean horror has been
Oh,
very
yeah.
popular here, but I think it resonates specifically with Americans because I think there's a lot of cultural similarities between American culture and South Korea. I don't know a super lot about South Korea, but just watching something like Parasite or Squid Game or one of those things, I'm like,
It's
this is
a
exactly
little too
what's going
relatable.
going on
Yeah.
here. So the way their country's structured must be very, very similar to this one because those movies and shows are very popular here.
Yeah.
And I completely understand why.
Yeah, I absolutely love the South Korean horror, Indonesian horror. If you want to watch some really crazy stuff, watch the Indonesian horror films. And I love how Japan's been kind of pushing forward on the madness for a long time. There's an anger that's at the bottom of the Japanese films. And I love talking to people who have a little bit of an understanding of it so they can let me know. Movies like, I'm trying to think, Creepy. Has anybody seen Creepy? You want to see something about pre-Parasite, the movie Creepy, about what can happen with the influence of a charismatic neighbor versus yourself, and how, yes.
Oh, I was just thinking, because you mentioned like Japanese horror, a lot of Japanese horror tends to deal with biology or science.
Tetsuo the Iron Man.
God, I fucking love that movie.
The cosplay I'm wearing is from Parasite Eve.
That game
video
was fantastic.
Which was based off of a horror novel in Japan that got made into a movie. You can find the movie for free with English subtitles on YouTube.
Is Parasite evil?
Parasite Eve.
Parasite Eve, yeah.
But it's all a lot of Japanese horror I found is either very supernatural and paranormal, like ghost or spirit based, or very, very biology and science gone wrong. I mean, Resident Evil came from there.
Yeah. So I wanted to get back to, I don't think we finished a question for you, and it goes into dovetailing with what you were talking about, Nick, we don't have who relates to the perfect guy or who relates to the perfectly evil person. And it has to do with representation, right? So I think representation is pretty important. What movie did you folks see that when you first saw it, you went, okay, I've seen a lot of movies, but this one's talking to me?
Session 9.
Session 9? Nice. All right, talk about that one, Mother.
Fucking mental illness. The fact that you
Yes.
don't know, I mean, it's really ambiguous. I mean, you're pretty sure how it works out at the end, but you never know whether it's just mental illness or if there's something else underpinning it all. I like that ambiguity of it. That you're in a place that was full of crazy people at one point and you're going mad as well. And I don't know, I deal with mental illness. I don't really like talking about it a whole lot, but I do. I've been forcing myself to do that a little bit more. And so movies like that, okay, Blair Witch was absolute garbage. It was a masterpiece for what it was, but it was a piece of shit.
I'll talk to you about that later.
Book of Shadows, Blair Witch 2 was a superior movie in every sense because it dealt with that as a real phenomenon where all these people fucking flocked to this town that wasn't prepared for them because they're a bunch of idiots who thought this movie was real. And then in that movie, you deal with like mass psychosis. Are these people losing their minds? Are they just kind of feeding on one another? Or is there something else going on? And I really like that ambiguity of that movie. Whereas Blair Witch itself, I thought was a just an utter steaming pile of crap. I saw it on LSD in the theater, and it was fantastic. And then went out in the hills and hung out for, like, I took another 10 strip, I think, between the time that I went to see it and when I went out to the hills. And so I was still, like, just tripping balls wandering around in the woods by myself. So, I mean, that part was fun. But then watching it sober, God, that movie was tedious and just horrible.
Isn't that how it goes,
No,
though?
at the in the Mouth of Madness. I saw that one, like, way out of my fucking mind. That one was amazing sober, too.
Sutter Kane.
Yep. Do you read Sutter Kane? But no, mental illness, movies like that deal with that question of whether are you mentally ill or is there something else going on really appeals to me. So
That's cool.
I don't know what my first one would be, but I could do a couple recent examples
Sure,
of movies
absolutely.
that really spoke to me. There's a certain thing personally that being misunderstood or being in a world that doesn't understand you, it seems to be where horror, what I find scariest. So things like a Mike Myers is of course scary. There's,
Right.
the shape is after you.
Yeah.
But like I saw this movie recently called Vivarium with
God,
Jesse
that was amazing.
Eisenberg. Jesse Eisenberg and Imogen Poots, I think. And it's about this, I'm assuming a lot of people haven't seen it. It's about this couple that go to this,
suburb.
it's a suburb, but like a planned community, and every house looks the same, and they drive in, and they go to check out the house, and then all of a sudden, they can't leave. They go to drive out, and all the roads loop back on each other, and there's no one else there, and they're all alone, and they're getting delivered food, and it doesn't taste like anything, and then they get delivered a baby, and they're expected to raise it, and it's just this, like, it's like a version of the world where it goes, these are the things that you're supposed to do, whether you understand why this is the way it is or not. We're not going to sit there and explain it to you, but you have to do this if you want to survive. And so that's like, as someone who's trying to create art and make it in the in the art world, writing specifically, having people understand me is like the most important thing. And I look at so many other people in my life that are doing more normal lifestyle choices. My sister is like a psychologist and owns a house, and I live in a tiny little apartment going, how am I going to pay my rent with books this month? So, yeah, that's the kind of stuff that really always spoke to me.
Yeah. So I did want to get back to Get Out, because you mentioned representation. I myself consider Get Out the Night of the Living Dead of this era. I think it does the same kind of thing. I think it has a revolutionary look at a monster movie that talks a lot about what's happening in the culture.
Oh, yeah.
And it does it for people who didn't get seen very often. I was lucky enough to have Tanana Reeve do on my show to talk about Horror Noir, which is a really great documentary that you can find on Shudder, which basically talks about the black experience through horror. And things that I didn't notice, obviously, blindsided all the time. And it was great to have her say, black people have always loved horror movies. Horror movies have not always liked black people.
No, she is such a great author, too.
Yeah, she's
Jesus.
fantastic. And she, one of the things that was mentioned was talking about Get Out, where I was shocked, just shocked, watching the movie and going, wow, that's a really original idea to have it be progressive liberals being the problem. And my black friends are like going, yeah, well, you may have a blind spot there, my friend. And so just on that itself, it's somewhat revolutionary because it takes it away from just being what we are so conditioned. Racist equals Southern redneck, so obvious. The idea that someone that was your ally is now quieting you by nodding and saying, yes, that's all great, and doing nothing. The very people that got bloody with you on a bridge are no longer doing that.
So no, it's like my trans friends that deal with that all the fucking time.
Yeah.
Where people are like, maybe just don't put it out there so much.
Right.
Don't be so over the top. Don't be so loud about it. And it's like, well, fuck you too.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And I think that's what's great. You're seeing, and that's one of the things that you'll hear a lot around horror at this point. I hate to use the tired word woke, but at the same point, you'll hear that. You'll hear that around sex, sexuality. I honestly think we got to get the fucking sex back in horror, right? But I don't mean the sex that was there in the 80s, which was for one group of people. 18-year-old white boys. Yeah, that was nudity.
There is gay
and
sex in
violence.
this.
Yeah. But sex and violence, yeah. What are people going crazy? Trans rights, correct? Mm-hmm. The idea of there being gender fluidity of any sort, the idea of sex being this morphing thing, that's Cronenbergian right there. Why are we not there? That is what horror is supposed to do. It's supposed to take the apple cart, flip it over, and say, pick them up yourself. Yeah.
That's why I love that the new Hellraiser was portrayed by a trans woman.
Yeah.
She was so fucking great in that role too.
So,
Yes.
Okay, it's a half-formed thought. Go with me.
I'm a
with you?
half-formed guy.
Awesome. So, as you're saying that, I'm thinking about harkening back to what you were talking about, with nuclear fear, and thinking about how many horror movies over the last decades has been mad scientists.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
now we're in a space where now we've got people questioning legitimized science.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering if there's any connection between the last, us watching 40 years of, 50, 60, 70, years of scientists being portrayed as out of control bad guys. And I'm wondering, I don't know, so that's my half-formed.
There's the argument, and it's been studied quite a bit, that adventure books, like back in the 1940s and stuff, like post World War II, there were all these little books that you could find in grocery stores that were like women in bondage,
Yep.
like tied up, gagged, bleeding, and it was all these stories that like young men's adventures, like where they would go out and rescue these women, but it was always women in real peril and danger, and that was what was on the forefront of the covers. And there's an argument that a fixation on those is part of what led to the surge in serial killers that we had throughout the 60s, 70s, and early 80s. Yeah, there is actually a lot of studies about that, because one thing that those individuals had in common beyond head injuries was that they were all fans of those stories. Frequently, they were also the children of veterans in World War II,
Right.
whose parents had come home
That's the other piece.
having experienced things that... So we talk about them being these great people, the veterans of World War II. They were doing horrendous things in the Pacific Islands. Ungodly, horrendous things that made some of the Vietnam vets look fucking sane. And so you have these people coming home damaged and unable to talk about any of this, because we didn't talk about PTSD. It didn't exist then. I mean, it existed, obviously, but we didn't know it existed, so there wasn't a thing for it. And then in Vietnam, they called it shell shock.
Yep.
But World War II, they didn't call it shit.
Genetics.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, we bring home all of this trauma and pass it down to the next generation.
Yeah.
Whether it's directly through parentage or through the fiction that's being created by the people who were damaged.
Yeah. And you see it constantly swirling around. That we're what's great is that we're in a time where we're calling each other out on this stuff. So you will see things like oh my goodness, Lovecraft Country,
Oh yeah.
which had this amazing stuff in it. But then they had one episode where what they were talking about was an old myth against Jews and the blood sacrifice.
Blood libel,
Yeah,
yep.
blood libel. And they got called on it. And they had to say, yeah, you're right. So it's not this thing of like anybody, once again, evil, good, or is it gradations that we're just all learning on. But I think that it's really intriguing that, speaking on Get Out one more time, that's one that, one of the things that I heard was, well, African Americans, one of the things that this talks about is like nasty surgeries against your will, and that there had been this whole thing of Tuskegee and stuff.
Oh shit, we did to indigenous people too.
Yeah,
Forced,
absolutely.
Yeah, forced sterilization.
Yeah, have you watched some of the Native American horror? Blood, oh my God, I forgot.
Blood Quantum.
Yeah, Blood Quantum. Yeah, amazing stuff in that.
Yeah,
And
forced
once again,
sterilizations and everything. It was
Yeah.
fucking horrible.
Yeah, more of where the horror of our world bleeds through in the story. Sometimes horror is like that Here, put it on the doll where society hurt you. Point it out on the doll. It's almost like that. There's that unconscious. Yes.
Because they mentioned like scientists and the portrayal of scientists. I've noticed that a lot of like older horror films or horror games or whatever tend to portray like the evil scientist when they did something horrible, like Resident Evil.
Yeah.
But I've noticed a shift in like the 2000s. It's more towards when you don't listen to the scientist.
Yeah.
You'll have like the scientist says we need to do like the first one I think of is Day After Tomorrow. It's like they don't listen to the scientists, and their boss, who are not scientists, or the corporate overlord, is like, no, we're
If it's not profitable, we never
I was
listen.
gonna say
Yeah.
the science trope or the mad scientist trope isn't gone. It's really just now a tech guy
Right.
doing it.
It's
and now
Elon Musk.
Yes, it's an Elon Musk or just some profit-driven corporation, head of the corporation that in AI. Yeah. So,
One of the things that I see, cults. The biggest thing going right now is there's some kind of cult thing. So it is in our system right now. We are squirting out what's been going on for the last decade.
And it isn't flavored this time.
Yeah, right. And so you have this whole deal about cults are more than just a religious thing, but there's a religious fervor.
Well,
And I
it's
think-
in-group, out-group, the kin selection bullshit.
Yeah.
I mean, it's part of it's hardwired into us.
Yeah. And then there's things like what I think is really incredible right now is there are a whole bunch of documentaries that are telling you that documentaries lie to you. It's astonishing to me.